All right, we can get started. Hopefully, if there's any audio issues, please let me know in the chat. All right, super nice to meet everyone. Just getting the admin out of the way. I've prepared about 15 minutes of content, and throughout the talk, if you have any questions, if you could just put it in the Q&A or the chat, and we can get to those, at the end of the talk. If not, there's no reason to kind of take everyone's time beyond that. Cool. Just to get started, hi, my name is Daniel. I'm a former venture capitalist at SoftBank Vision Fund. It's a $150 billion fund that invests in tech companies, and a current founder backed by a company called Y Combinator. And I've gotten into the medium writing a little bit. What kind of the gist of this talk is this: if someone had told me that I could pay rent by writing once a month, I would have called it a scam. But in the last month or so, I generated about $1,800 by writing just once a month on Medium, and I think it's super cool that I'm here. And in the last 12 months or so, and just to be clear, I don't think these are markers of anything you'd expect from like a top writer. But what I've tried to do is apply some of the principles I learned as a startup founder and apply that into the field of writing for the last 12 months. And I've been running this experiment, and over the last 12 months, I've got about 100K reads with a bunch of publications like Entrepreneur's Handbook and Better Humans. Received a bunch of inbounds to be a speaker, and then earned about the 2K or so this month on Medium. So I'm going to talk about maybe 3 different things in the chat here today. The first is writer content fit. The second is content market fit. And then the last thing is generating real value. So to dive into the first piece of writer content fit, startups talk a lot about founder market fit. All that means is, are you the right person to be building this? And what unfair advantage do you have to go build this company? A lot of the times it comes to some specialized knowledge, some skill, or some distribution advantage or some network advantage. So why are you the right person to be building this company? And I think a lot of this sort of applies to the writers as well. Like, what unfair advantage do we have writers to have people listen to us? And maybe you already have a group of community or friends who are interested in this, or maybe you have some special understanding or inner workings of something, and maybe you kind of like enjoy. Maybe there's like a distribution advantage that you have that others don't have. The 2 that I try to lean in on as I was doing this experiment of like, okay, why am I the right writer to be doing this content, which is like the writer content fit part of it, is immersion into the experience and credibility, right? By immersion into the experience, I talk a lot about startups and venture capital, and it's like very natural to me because I live and breathe this every single day. I don't need to squeeze content out of my head or lean on other people's experiences for this. There's like a lot of backlog of writing that I could be doing. Like, when a billionaire texts you, we need to talk, or I spilled water on my computer 24 hours before our demo, or hey, like the bank ran out of money with my money still in that account, right? So I'm not making any of this up. This is referring to like the SVB bank run that happened earlier this year. So I'm not making this up. I'm immersed into it. I don't need to do a lot of research. I just need to talk about exactly what I'm facing today. The other thing I really try to lean on is credibility. Like, why would people want to listen, particularly about startups and venture capital, to me? So for me, I used to be an investor at SoftBank Vision Fund and managed around $150 billion of assets. And what it does is specifically invest into tech companies to help them grow. Companies like Uber, DoorDash, 10x Genomics, Grab, a bunch of these companies that are out there today. And having been a venture capital investor, I can talk about my experience there. On the startup side, I'm currently a founder backed by a accelerator. All that means is like a small community of people who help you kind of build your company called Y Combinator. And it's the same community and institution that helped to raise some of the biggest names that we know today, like Airbnb, Twitch, Stripe, and Coinbase. So if you are, say, an aspiring venture capitalist or aspiring startup person already in the field, it might be interesting for you. So there's a bunch that you could lean into. It can actually be related to your expertise, whether it's about music or anything else. It could be about a particular distribution or community that you have. So like, what some unfair advantage do you have to have people listen to you and write about that specific content? Again, you don't need everything, but hopefully you'll have 1 or 2 to lean into. The other thing that we talk about a lot in the startup world is a term called product market fit. All that means is, can we validate demand for our product? Like, do people even want what we're making? And in the case of product in startups, the base unit is a piece of software. In the writing world, I think the base unit is our writing, whether typically on Medium, like our particular articles. So how do we validate this demand? And I think that's like the piece that I try to apply when it comes to startup guidelines and into the writing space. And every piece of my writing actually started with a prompt, and that's usually someone asking me a question or a piece of advice that they asked me for, or something that I was personally curious about. And that's kind of how I thought about it. And while like this is not to say that we should cater all of our writing to having it sell or getting more views, I do think that it's a good practice to have to validate demand. Like, do people actually want to read about what we're writing? And I think every post I make, I think of as a mini experiment. I think that's the second part to this. The way startups think about getting to product market fit is not doing it once and saying, well, I guess people didn't like my product. We try to iterate and run multiple experiments to get to that product market fit. In this case, content market fit. Like, what do people want? So you could, play around with like the headlines. You could play around with your credibility. You can play around with like the style of writing that you have. What do people actually want to talk about here, right? And while there is a good connection between like writer content fit and then content market fit, it doesn't always pull through. Like, I'll give you an example. Like, an experiment that I run that completely bombed was writing about policy. So I wrote a piece on the Russia-Ukraine conflict when it was at its peak and when it was at its hottest. So, right, there's a lot of tailwind going for me. And then I thought I had the credibility because I have a graduate degree in public policy from University of Oxford. So I said, okay, these two things are going. Why don't I run an experiment? This is the worst performing article I've ever written on Medium, right? So there's a bunch of things to go test and say, well, I'm not going to write about this because clearly, like, people on Medium, or at least my followers and my audience, really doesn't care about this. They really want me to zone in on that niche of how to build like a startup, how to make career decisions, how to kind of talk about VC and invest in companies. So that's content market fit, to think about that. The last thing that I'll talk about, and I don't think writers do this too often, it's a thing of generating real value. And in Y Combinator, there's a slogan called "Make something people want." And we're taught that the secret to building a successful company is to build what people want, and in other words, create value for people. And as a writer, I think I try to do that as much as I can. And each piece of my writing, again, I only publish once a month. I don't really publish that often because I do not have the capacity. But it's to add as much value as I can in a single piece of article in the roughly 2,000 word range that I have today. And really trying to avoid a lot of this clickbait stuff as much as I can. And I think it's not a coincidence that Medium released new partner program policies on how to generate cash. And a lot of these principles are embedded, a lot of these startup principles are embedded into their new rules. And it's no wonder, because Medium is also a startup that was VC funded, right? So I think it's good to think in this framework here. More specifically, I think by creating value, I mean just focusing on inherent value that we generate rather than sort of like the vanity metrics. So in the startup world, we call these KPI. In any world, I guess we call these KPIs, or key performance indicators. What we don't want to do is kind of rely on vanity metrics. What I've seen in the past and these programs I've seen was, hey, let's look at like the total view count we have on this article, or let's look at the number of articles per week we can generate, or how many words are we generating. A lot of these things are very quantifiable, and there's like a lot of temptation to make this into some metric and say, let's make this metric grow. But in reality, I think what people actually want is, how many people are reading my stuff? How many people are becoming either my followers and ideally my subscribers, like that care enough to click a button and say, I want what this person is generating in the future, directly into my inbox. And then like, how much money can I generate off that? These are probably like the correct indicators to think about and the right variables to grow. And you don't want to optimize for the wrong things. So if you start optimizing for something like the number of views. You might be tempted to just write as many articles as you want with very short pieces, right? That I don't think is very, very helpful. So to not incentivize the wrong things, I think those are it. I think that's mostly what I had. Again, like I'm not a successful writer in any sense, but if I can generate $2,000 a month writing once a month by applying some of this principle, hopefully when you apply some of these principles to your own writing, you can be a much, much more successful and influential writer than me. So to wrap up, I think first is like really think about the writer content fit. Like, why are you the right person to be writing about this particular thing? And hopefully you have like one or two really good reasons to do that. For me, it was immersive and credibility. The second is, how do you know that people want your writing? And try to like tune and iterate your writing multiple times to get to the market fit that people want. Like, what do your readers want to learn about, and what do they actually value? And that's kind of the last point of, optimize the right things to make sure that you're creating real value for your readers, and hopefully they'll continue to stick around. That's everything that I had to talk about in terms of this chat. I don't know if anyone had any questions. Feel free to go through the questions. Otherwise, happy to kind of end the session early. But I think on the Q&A, you can go ahead. You can chat. You can have the chat. Feel free to use the chat as well. Yeah, so the question that I got was, tell us more about how you earned. Yeah, so I guess both of these questions are related. So for the $2,000 per month on Medium, this was from my last month's earning. And a lot of it was from this one article I called 3 Reasons to Consider Before Joining a Startup. It did really, really well. So the 2K is entirely from Medium, right? There are other ways that I earned money from this, and I'm happy to go into detail on how I did that. But yeah, so out of like, I think it was like almost $1,900, like 18 something. Most of it came from the actual Read Partner Program. And then I think $50 worth it was coming from the referral program. I think that they've gotten rid of going forward. That's where it came from. The other ways that I generate cash from this is, one, I do have a buy me a coffee, and I think I generated about like a lifetime value of maybe $100, $200. It wasn't a lot of money. And then this also links into my personal website where I provide some coaching for startup founders. So, and do expert calls. Expert calls, if you guys are interested, are run by these large institutions like GLG or Alpha Sites and a few others, where they will contact you to talk about your expertise for half an hour to an hour, and then they'll pay you for it. So I think last year that generated another $8,000 or so for me. And this year, that's continuing to rack up as well. Cool. According to all applies. Good way to the question that I got was another way to define your base. Bob, if you're in the chat, can you help me understand what you mean by your base, like my customer base? Yeah, as Bob is maybe getting to that. Yeah, the question from Patrick, what was the website where they ask you for your expertise? It's there's a bunch of these out there. If you go Expert Call Networks on Google, you should be able to get maybe top 10. The 2 that I use is GLG and Alpha Sites. And typically they want to learn about a very particular niche thing, and they link you with their customers who will pay you for that. The payment goes through them, so you don't, if it's there's no worry about who's on the other side. So they will pay for them. As really talk about writing that goes on. Oh yeah, sorry. It was really to talk more about the writing, the viral enough to produce that kind of revenue. Yeah. So for this thing, just to be clear, I published on the publications Started Up. I also use a lot of publications to go do this. Entrepreneur's Handbook, I think I've published with many times. The Startup, I think, is one. Better Humans is the other publication. I think I published with maybe two or three. And I think that's kind of using publications helpful. That being said, they didn't boost my story. It just kind of happened to be a good one. Also, it goes back to the point of constantly running iterative experiments. What I found is like people, at least my audience, doesn't really care about, personal reflections or anything along those lines. They want help with making good decisions in their own careers and learning about different careers and different tactics to get whatever it is that they want. So I had a pretty good sense with the headline article, for example, which was 3 reasons to not join a startup when everyone else wants to join a startup, would do pretty well. And so most of my articles generate about $300 to $400. So I don't think this is a one-off. I think it's repeatable to generate articles that generate a lot of cash. My most recent one, yes, was a lot more than usual, but I don't think this is quite an exception. Like, for example, I also know that, a piece that I wrote about traveling the world and getting efficiency was not going to do well because my audience doesn't really care about that. But I still wrote that for myself. Cool. And it looks like, Nicole, your question has been answered. Yeah, just go expert call networks, and there's a bunch of them that are out there, and you can go and sign up. Cool. Yeah, sorry, Bob, I just got it. Particular art, poetry, music, potential customer base. Yeah, I think so. When it comes to like content, this is like it looks like you want to write about art, poetry, and whatnot. So you know what you want to write about. I guess what you're going out and testing is like, is there a market for this? Particularly on a thing like Medium, right? Presumably we're using Medium because we don't have a huge distribution network, right? And Medium happens to distribute our content. Other things like Substack, Patreon, and other ways to generate cash in your content requires for you to bring your own audience, right? So assuming that you want distribution, you want to think about running different experiments to see, like, is this a good market and do people want my writing? And I hardly think that it's a genre issue. It's usually a headline and the style of writing. So for example, when you talk about art, like, are there ways to generate cash using art or poetry, right? People might be so interested. You're still writing about art, but the value that you generate is like helping people understand how to make money off of that, rather than talking about the intricacies of art. And I think that's kind of a test that you have to run. Like, for example, my hunch is that on Medium, talking about a in-depth analysis of English lit is probably not going to be super popular. There's going to be a very small niche of people who want that. But there's probably a lot of people who want to learn how to make, like, how to generate something, like how to do a side hustle, or how to get an e-commerce business started up, or how to think about art that applies to them in a particular way. So I would continue to experiment with the content and see what happens there. Yeah, if there's any other questions, like, feel free to go do this video and bring them to Medium on YouTube as well to get an audience, but once you have that circle of regular. Yeah, so I mean, congrats on getting 30 to 100K views per 8-minute video. That's a pretty good metric for a YouTuber. Presumably you have a lot of subscribers. Yeah, conversion rate, as you know, like across platforms, is pretty bad, right? So even if you have a bunch of followers on YouTube, particularly TikTok has one of the worst conversion rates into your other social media. The thing that I do is, like, for me, I have a link in bio that I use. It's a company called Beacons, but there's a bunch that are out there, right? So Beacons is one, Linktree is one, Stan is another. So there's a bunch of these that you can have where you can funnel all of your audience into one. The benefit of this is, like, your audience can then start, like, giving their emails to you so you can reach out directly, rather than relying on, like, a platform. This is a common problem that we've run with, right? In terms of the conversion, honestly, I'm not sure if a video watching user will want to go to a writing, like a reading version. They're presumably on YouTube because they prefer watching videos rather than reading. So unless you can provide like exceptional value on them by reading that you can't provide on the video, I'm not sure how you would, convert them over over to Medium. I would just think about bringing them to like a centralized place, like a link in bio, and then have them decide like what they want to go to. Obviously, that adds like an additional step of friction, but hopefully it'll be helpful. Cool. Yeah. How do I build a new audience on Medium knowing the topics that are interests to my demographic? Oh, okay. I mean, Medium does the distribution for you, so hopefully you can just plug in your Medium and people will go read about it from like YouTube. But I think Medium does their own distribution. The thing that I used is honestly just like getting them into as many communities as possible. So I talked about like starting with a prompt, like always starting with a prompt. Like, is someone asking me for this information? And like, how often is that happening? All of my articles began with someone asking me for this information. And when I did it for one person, it turns out many people that is of that similar demographic or that audience wants that. So my audience is startup founders or people who want to get into startups. And if they ask me a question, it turns out 100 other people in that demographic want that question. So it's not very hard for me to forward this article to one person and they forward to the rest of the articles. A recent case is like I wrote a piece on how to get a job in a startup, right? And this piece then got circulated to a bunch of group chats that I didn't know about of a lot of these like tech people post their layoffs. And then that became a little bit viral that way too. So I think just that's kind of the product, like the content market fit of it. Like, can you get to a piece of content that is interesting and validate the demand as much as you can? Cool. Are there any? If there are any other questions, I don't think we don't need to stick around for too long. Yeah, if there's any other questions, please let me know and happy to do so. Happy to answer any other questions. I'm not sure what this moderation piece is. There's about 3 people who are asking to join. Let's give this a go. I think that's it. Okay. I mean, it looks like that's the end of the questions. If you have any other questions on the side, I've put my kind of links up here to reach out via Medium, my personal website, and anything else. So thanks a lot for listening, and hope you have the rest of a good Medium day. Thanks.